What is going on, everybody? We finally have something that we have been waiting for quite some time, and that is the full unveiling of both the Oppo Find N2 and the Oppo Find N2 Flip. In this video, I'm going to break all of this stuff down for you. I have a couple very handy Twitter threads that we're going to use to read through these specs, what these devices look like, lots of photos, lots of videos, lots of cool stuff here. Let's get into that breakdown now. We're going to start off here with the Oppo Find N2. This is their Z Fold competitor, and you can see here that it does look fairly similar to the original Find N. I didn't mention this in the thread, so I'll mention it here. It is a side-mounted fingerprint scanner, which I have absolutely no problem with at all, but I do like the appearance of this device. I like how it is shorter and wider than your standard foldable device, compared in particular to the Z Fold 4. But let's dig in here. As I was saying, Oppo just made the sequel official, and it seems to address some of the biggest issues with the prior Find N, which was a relatively thick, it was quite a chunky device, and it was not light by any stretch of the imagination. 275 grams is a pretty heavy device. Now we're down to a paltry 233 grams. That actually makes it considerably lighter than the Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 4. So, good job there by Oppo. Weight is a big concern with these foldable devices, right? They're big, and when they fold over, they're pretty thick. Well, this thing has gotten thinner and lighter, so when it's in your pocket, it is not going to feel all that crazy. The weight reduction is due in part to a redesign of the hinge, which apparently features far fewer parts, as well as new materials being used like carbon fiber. We are also going from 15.9 millimeters when it's closed, so folded over, and 8 millimeters when it's open, down to 14.6 and 7.4. Of course, the Z Fold 4 is a bit harder to quantify because when it is folded shut, it is actually kind of slanted. So it goes from 14.2 millimeters up to 15.8 at its thickest point nearer to the hinge, and then it is 6.3 millimeters whenever it is open. So you can see in some ways the fold is actually still thinner, and in other spots it's actually going to be thicker, again because of the hinge design, which of course I've embedded a video in this tweet, which I will let play for just a brief moment here. The hinge is a really important thing when it comes to these folding devices, not just because of the weight, the thickness, and all of these things, but also because of how it affects the crease. You can see there that that hinge, that's what's folding the screen over. And that new hinge is said to reduce the depth of that crease by 67%, making the crease even harder to see than before. And it was already far harder to see than the crease on the Z Fold line, which is very, very easy to spot. Now, I don't have any great images of the Find N2, like shown off axis and so forth, trying to show this. But at any rate, the Find N original was very hard to see. So if this is even harder to see, well, that's going to be a good improvement. This new hinge also can be locked at different degrees of open or close, anywhere between 45 and 125. So this is something that the Fold is able to do, and now the Find N2 is going to have this ability, which allows you to do a lot of cool things, right? Set this thing up like its own little tripod. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this, so it's going to gain that functionality as well. The cover display, this is kind of interesting to me. It was already sort of a short, wide, fat kind of cover display, in particular when you compare it to the Z Fold 4, which is a TV remote. It is apparently getting even shorter than before. So the aspect ratio before was basically 2:1, 18:9, so it was twice as tall as it was wide. Now it's actually 17.7:9, so even shorter than before. It does now run at 120 hertz and has a peak brightness of 1350 nits, which is quite bright. So the internal display is staying pretty much the same, 7.1 inches and 9.6:9 aspect ratio. So it's only slightly wider than it is tall, almost a square. We are still running at 120 hertz, and we are now going up to 1550 nits peak brightness, which is very, very bright. So what about that triple camera setup? So the primary is going to be a 50 megapixel 1/1.56 inch Sony IMX 890. This is a newer sensor, and this should be an upgrade from the original Find N. The ultra wide is a 48 megapixel 1/2 inch Sony IMX 581, and the telephoto will be a 32 megapixel 1/2.74 inch Sony IMX 709. It will zoom at 2x, again, telephoto. Both selfie cameras are 32 megapixels. This on paper is a very strong camera setup. There are some early samples being posted, but we'll wait for full reviews to really have a full say on how this camera setup is going to behave. Now, the Oppo Find N2 is still running the same Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1, which is not necessarily a problem, although you'd like to see it be on the newest silicon. But again, this is not really a big deal. 12 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage, a 4520 milliamp hour battery charging at 67 watts. So, in a lot of ways, in particular, that battery and the charging is probably going to top what Samsung has here with the Z Fold, which charges at a much slower rate. Now, unfortunately, there is no current word of a release outside of China. This is very likely to be just like the Find N original, a China-only device, unlike the Oppo Find N2 Flip, which we are now going to much more quickly, I hope, run through. This is the Oppo Find N2. I think that this is, like, from a visual perspective, I think this thing looks absolutely fantastic. It is folding flat, has a massive cover display. I think it looks really, really good. So let's dive into this now. This is the Oppo Find N2 Flip, sporting a 6.8-inch display and a massive 3.26-inch cover display, and you can see this little embedded tweet here by Ice Universe, some of the stuff that you can do with that giant cover display. It's just nice, right? Big screens are better, and I love the fact that this screen is like a similar aspect ratio to the actual phone screen, so that's going to open up the door to doing all kinds of things, running full apps if you want on that cover display. I mean, TikTok, as this looks to be something kind of TikTok-ish, would work quite fine on a device like this. So there's going to be times when you might not even need to open this thing. You know, you can text and so forth on the current cover display on like the Flip and the Flip 3, Flip 4. But this just looks so much better to me. If we scroll down here, the hinge is very, very impressive. And this has once again allowed Oppo to have a device that has a nearly invisible crease on their device. You pretty much can't see anything. Now, I'm sure if you held this thing at just the right angle and just the right light, you could probably still spot that crease, but it's going to be much harder to see than the crease is on the Samsung Flip series. The camera setup actually does look pretty decent. You have a 50 megapixel primary and an 8 megapixel ultra wide. It's a little bit weaker on the ultra wide in terms of just the resolution, but you know, look, the Flip 4 that it's competing with doesn't have the greatest camera setup in the world, so that 50 megapixel, if it can beat the primary, if you just go primary for primary, I think that that might be good enough to be able to compete pretty well, and there also is a 32 megapixel hole punch selfie camera. Now, rather interestingly, this phone is said to forego the Qualcomm Snapdragon chips and instead go with a MediaTek Dimensity 9000 Plus. Now, this might scare some people, but I don't think it actually should, right? MediaTek has actually proven themselves to be quite solid, and the Dimensity chips have been really, really good as of late. So I think performance is going to be very strong. Image processing has been okay on some other devices, so I think we're going to be fine here. We're going to have 8 gigs of RAM and then 256 gigs of storage. I didn't actually see anybody mentioning a smaller storage variant, so that's kind of interesting as well. We do have a 4300 milliamp hour battery and 44 watt wired charging, so these are both improvements over Samsung's device. The Flip was said to be arriving in China now, but in Europe in early 2023. Now, pricing, if you translate it over, will be right around $860 or around 700 pounds. So, you know, that does make it cheaper than the Flip series as well. Now, it's hard to say what that price is actually going to be because it's more complicated than that, right? When devices leave their home country and get exported to other countries, sometimes that price goes up further. So I would guess probably right around that $1,000 mark. It's probably going to be a pretty safe spot. There is no word on a release in the United States for this or the Find N2, the actual tablet device. Europe for the Flip, and probably only China for the, like I said, the tablet device. So there you go. That's pretty much everything we currently know about the Find N2 and the Find N2 Flip. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button on your way out. I'll see you on the next one. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.